Hey everybody, if you're new here, my name is Jake, and today we're going to be looking at a bootcamp from altacademy.com, or I should say altcademy.com. As someone who went through a bootcamp myself and went on to become a software engineer and have a little bit more experience in the field, it's fun to come back and look at these curriculums and bootcamps, offer some criticism of my own, and maybe say some things that I like about the program so that anybody interested in maybe attending this bootcamp has another opinion to go off. Please take my opinions with a grain of salt. I've never spoken to anybody at Altcademy or any students who have graduated there. So take what I have to say and form your own opinions from it. So let's get into this. They have a couple different programs on their website, altcademy.com. You can go check it out. I selected the full stack web development and downloaded the curriculum, so we can just jump into that. Okay, so their curriculum is quite detailed. They go through this from the perspective of really making it legible and understandable for the student or someone who's not experienced reading it, which I really like that. A lot of the curriculums we've looked at previously just kind of point out technologies and don't really explain what they are. This is clearly geared towards someone who's reading this curriculum who has really no experience. So big thumbs up to them for making it very readable and understandable. They have a very general overview here, but to just get into it, we start with HTML and CSS here. So part one, they're going to have 10 parts on HTML and CSS. I'm not going to go over every single line in here. Like I said, it's quite detailed and has a lot of explanation for those who don't know what these technologies are. So I'll just try to highlight things as I see them and comment on that. HTML and CSS syntax, that's great. Then they bring you into elements and the DOM, the selectors, properties, values, commenting, using a code editor, building your first web page, and getting familiar with the dev tools. Okay, so this is a solid first part. Then we get into the fundamentals, so the semantics, block and inline elements, nesting of elements, text elements, structure elements, hyperlinks, lists, images, videos, iframes, tables, forms, best practices, and creating multi-pages. Okay, so kind of moving on to a little bit more in-depth for HTML, that's great. Then we get into part three, which is the CSS stuff. Okay, so these are all pretty standard things here, colors, lengths, typography, great. That's awesome. But good to know CSS coming up right after HTML. That's a nice logical progression. So some more advanced CSS stuff, talking about the box model, positioning, grid structure. Okay, so now we get into Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a framework that sits on top of HTML and CSS and allows you to have access to a component library and some style sheets that make styling your website easier. So I like Bootstrap. I don't always see it. There's a lot of other popular frameworks like Tailwind CSS and a lot of Angular has its own grid library that comes with it if you don't want to use Bootstrap. Bootstrap is still a great library to learn. So talks about this, the grid system, responsiveness. Okay, great. So then we're getting into more advanced CSS with Bootstrap. Some of this stuff is maybe not so necessary, I guess, but still fine. Animation, Flexbox, Bootstrap 4, okay. Now we're switching to the development cycle with Git. So we're learning about how to use Git and track versions. After you kind of learn the HTML and CSS basics in Bootstrap, then I guess they're gonna move over to using Git basically to work with a project. That's a good time to introduce it, that's fine. And then part 8 is where you do a project with HTML and CSS. And then part 9 is where you migrate to Bootstrap 5, which is the newer version of Bootstrap that doesn't use jQuery. Yeah, I think that's good. You're not going to really need jQuery. So nice, very cool. And then part 10 is deploying a basic HTML, CSS website. I've spoken about this before. I don't really think deployment is a super important thing to learn when you're first getting started, but I do like that they've listed a couple different ways to deploy your project that is really, really simple. So it kind of gets the message across of this is what deploying is and why we do it and what it's for, but not into the nitty gritty of cloud hosting providers and stuff like that. So these are really nice and simple. Yeah, so that first HTML and CSS section was pretty good, pretty strong. So now we get into JavaScript. So we have 8 parts to this section on JavaScript. So the first one is the intro. We talk about values and types, operators, variables. Great. Then we get into the basic program structure, so statements, expressions, conditionals, loops, switches, and maybe a syntax guide here. And function fundamentals, okay, so defining functions, side effects and return values, parameters, scopes and closures, declaration and expressions, a little bit about the call stack, that's good, and learning to keep your code dry. So then we go into object data structure. We talk about arrays, object properties and methods, array properties and methods, built-in data objects, arguments object, and the math object. I wonder if we spend any time talking about data structures and algorithms in a more general context instead of just applied to JavaScript. That would be nice. It is good to know how they function within JavaScript, but from a more like academic general sense, it's good to have some understanding for just general knowledge, and then also for when you go into interviews. Part 5, advanced function concepts. Okay, so we talk about recursion, higher order functions, passing by reference. Okay, yeah, I guess this is good stuff to know. Yep, definitely recursion. Part 6, advanced object concepts. So object-oriented programming, prototype-based programming. Everything is an object, the this variable, constructors, and prototype interference and inheritance, and primitive values and object wrappers. Okay, yeah, these are certainly some more advanced topics. I think object-oriented programming is probably the most important here. The rest of this stuff is good to know. Part 7, bonus concepts, regular expressions. You don't really need to study that, I don't think. It's helpful. It can be helpful in certain situations. I've had a couple interview questions where there was a regular expression that helped me out a lot when it came to like string manipulation and stuff, but not really important. Not that big of a deal. Debugging, that's really great. And then some programming exercises. Okay, and then they have a JavaScript project. Overall, the JavaScript section of this curriculum is pretty strong, so I like a lot of the stuff they talked about. Okay, dynamic website development. How does JavaScript work with HTML and CSS? Okay, so this is tying back into the first section that we learned about HTML and CSS. There are 6 sections, so start with the DOM. So it talks about the DOM structure, traversing it and finding elements. Then manipulation, so moving or removing nodes, creating, inserting new nodes, editing nodes and attributes and styles, and animation. Then we talk about DOM events, so event listeners and handlers. Maybe we touch on the event loop somewhere in here, I'm not sure. Mouse events, scroll events, key events, focus events, load events, timers, debouncing events, and then we create a small project in Vanilla.js. Right away, I think events are great, but going back up to this part 2, I don't really think you need to know how the DOM API works in this context, because as we'll probably see later, we're going to use a framework on top of this that handles most of this. But moving on, part 4, JavaScript libraries, jQuery and underscore. I'm just going to skip this whole thing. I don't think jQuery or underscore is relevant nowadays. It's just unnecessary. So you can save some time by just not learning that. Persistent data storage with backend servers, basic front-end websites, blah, 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 cannot store state. They actually can by storing data in the browser itself, but I get what they're trying to get to here. This is really cool. They teach TCP, IP, and HTTP into XHR and AJAX, and then to API and JSON. I think as long as not too much time is spent here, this is a really good like foundational understanding that can lead you up to your API and JSON kind of calls and things like that. And this is nice foundational knowledge that, I thought was kind of missing from other programs where they wanted to teach you like advanced networking stuff, but they left out the basics. So big thumbs up, big thumbs up. CRUD and RESTful APIs, that's great. And then there is a project. Okay, so I thought the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript section was pretty good. I think some of the nitty-gritty stuff to do with the DOM API is not super necessary. As far as like part 2 DOM manipulation, probably not super necessary. DOM events are good to understand, but as far as how to access them with the Vanilla.js, probably not super important to be like adept at that or anything, because again, you're going to be using probably React or some other program to handle that. So you'd want to study it in the context of React. And then also jQuery and underscore are just unnecessary. So a couple issues with that last section, but a lot of other good things about it, like the TCP, IP, HTTP study. And then, yeah, React.js is the next section. So there's 5 sections to this one. So first one is JavaScript ES6. So basically covering the new things that were introduced in ES6. I think that's fine. A lot of these things are used pretty commonly, so that's fine. Okay, basic React. So I'm not, like, full disclosure, I'm not much of a React person, so I can't really comment on this with experience, but it's good to learn React. It's a really popular framework, so I'm sure all of these are pretty important things to study. So then they have intermediate React, so more advanced React related subjects. And then they have you create a React app with Node, and I think this might be the first time they've introduced Node and NPM. Running it locally, adding dependencies, single page, okay. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then they have a React project. I don't know why they have create a React app and then create a project right next to each other. That kind of seems like the same thing. Okay, and then they transitioned to Ruby programming. So interesting. I know that their website mentioned there was a couple different languages you can choose from, and Ruby was one of them. So maybe they chose Ruby to just be the default for this curriculum. I don't know, because I didn't select Ruby when I downloaded this curriculum. But, you know, it is what it is. They chose Ruby. Again, this is something I may have mentioned before, but I wish that when they teach backend languages, they'd teach you a static language. But yeah, that's fine. Okay, so part 1 is installation, getting set up. Okay, part 2 is basics, so values and types, comparison, logical operators, and built-in methods. So this is probably just to kind of differentiate it from what you learned in the JavaScript sections. So program structure, it's going to be a different program structure than in JavaScript. So yeah, they have some points on that. Variables, functions, control flow, and best practices in Ruby. Data structure, so they're introducing arrays and hashes in the context of Ruby and how they work differently. Again, I wish the data structures was more focused in a like academic and general conceptual area as opposed to super language specific. Okay, again, we're going over object-oriented programming, but in the context of Ruby. Yeah, so you will understand the fundamental design of OOP and how it's applied to Ruby. So, I mean, at least we're learning the fundamentals and then applying it to Ruby. More emphasis on the fundamentals would probably be better. Finally, there's some Ruby exercises. Okay, at the end, we have this is just a description of what backend applications are. So in this section, we have 9 different parts discussing backend in general, it looks like. Okay, so part 1 is Rails installations. I think we already covered this in the last one, but they have a third-party services section. Okay, so this is where you would integrate into some different hosting environments. Okay, and then now they're talking about model view controller, the architectural concept for Ruby, and kind of going over how that fits into everything. Interesting. And then they're talking about writing backend web apps. So database, interesting that we're just getting to database now. I think it would have been nice to talk about that during the Ruby section. And it doesn't, I don't know if they're spending more time on this. This seems like a kind of big topic to just put into one subsection of a part. And then we talk about models, controllers, database migrations. Okay, so there's a section on the database and a section on the migrations. And then associations between tables, gem files. Then we have testing, views, environments. Part 4, learn by example, and you're going to create a to-do list. And then in part 5, you deploy the application. I feel like we're kind of like steamrolling over the database section. Even though they had 3 here, I would have preferred a bigger breakdown of that. Especially because like the model and controller should have been covered in the object oriented, or sorry, in the model view controller section here. So I don't know why we have 2 points here for it. So part 5, deploying your app. You know, we already talked about this before. As long as it's simple, it's fine. Don't want to get too in the weeds. Model validations are good. User authentication, as long as it's simple, then I'm okay with it. This seems, you know, maybe a little complicated. I wouldn't spend too much time on this. And then you build a Twitter clone. That seems like it's kind of complicated for like a project. I don't know how long they're going to give you to do this, but that's an interesting goal. Part 9, libraries and integrations, photo upload. Okay, so basically integrating with different APIs and stuff. That's pretty good knowledge. Okay, and then full stack development. So what is monolithic structure versus split structure? Oh, sorry, 3 parts. And then, okay. So the first part is the front end in Ruby on Rails. So we learned what the front end API looks like and how you can build front ends with it. I wouldn't really, I don't really see Ruby used in the front end very often. I know you can, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. Part 2, full stack Airbnb app. So again, we're trying to make a clone of an application. It would be good to know if these are group projects, because these are pretty ambitious, so it may be difficult for a single person unless they're given like a skeleton or a template to build off. Part 3, deployment and enhancements. Again, a lot of focus on deployment. I feel like if we already learned deployment once or twice, and you're not really, okay, I guess we're adding HTTPS here and custom domains, but I feel like we already kind of covered this, maybe not necessary to like beat it into the ground. Okay, and then there's a capstone project, which I'm guessing is some sort of group project. Terms define the decorative, okay, blah, 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 blah. It is the center of your portfolio. Remember, people don't look at your portfolios. I hate to say it. It would be rare for someone to look at your portfolio, go into the actual code that you've written on your GitHub and look at it. It looks really nice though. I mean, it looks like they're actually tracking you. And project idea generation, you're wasting time here. Coming up with ideas for apps is like one of the most time wasting activities you could do. You're here to like study and learn things, not come up with like marketing pitches. So I would just completely skip this. Just use a pre-existing application idea, like make a Twitter clone or something. You're there to study and learn, so just don't waste your idea on this stuff. Yeah, like marketing research, like why? Okay, planning. So scope and timeline, wireframe the user interface. Oh, this is pretty in depth. My advice would be that this is good experience, but my question is, how long do you have to do this? Looking at this, you want to talk about scope and timeline. Looking at the scope of the project you have here, this should be like a month-long project. And even then, you're going to struggle to conduct user testing, plan your data. There's no way. Like this is just too difficult. If you were like a star student, you might be able to get this done in a month, and it would still be the struggle bus. So speaking of which, this kind of gets to the core of the issue with this curriculum. I'll say before I move on, the curriculum itself is really solid. I had only a minor few pieces of criticism or subjects that I didn't really think were worth studying. A lot of it was really good, and there was a couple big thumbs up I had. So I will say the full stack development syllabus looks like a set of logically defined topics that I like, and a few really cool things, and just a couple things I maybe would skip. So moving on from the curriculum, for Altcademy, it seems like this bootcamp is run a little differently, so I think we need to put that into context before giving a final review. So if you go to How Do We Teach, you see that you pick out a curriculum, and then you learn, build, get hired, blah, 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 blah. What does that actually mean? Well, essentially, this is describing their curriculum, but essentially it's all online. So it's 100% online, and basically you join like a chat group. You can access teacher resources if you need to ask questions, and you can ask other students what they're up to. They offer a Q&A database, so that would be like access to specific questions that have been asked before on projects that you've worked on. And then they also have an SLA or whatever what you want to call it, essentially, where they will answer your questions if you submit them in a certain amount of time, so that you can turn around and get stuff done. And they have office hours, so that you can show up and ask questions on a Google or GVC or something like that, or a video chat of your choice, as opposed to like a typical boot camp where you're showing up in person and you're there 8, 9, 10 hours a day. This is all online, done on your own time, and then they have a couple teacher resources available to you to use as you need them. On top of that, they do progress monitoring and kind of will reach out to you to see if things are going well. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of how they run their stuff. I mean, they have quizzes and exercises just like all the other boot camps, but it's done remotely, and they expect you to do this by yourself and then kind of use these chat groups and office hours and QA database. So I think in the context of that, I think that has to be something that's taken into consideration for you. as opposed to, the boot camp where you're actually going to be in there 8 to 10 hours a day and being there hands-on with other people. This is going to be a little bit of a disconnect. I know people like to say that, oh, it's just as easy to use chat rooms and stuff like that as being in person. And I would say it really depends on the person. A lot of people really, really absorb information the best when they're in person paying attention and they have somebody there with them that they can discuss with. And they might struggle a lot when it comes to self-study at home, and they're not really sure when to use the chat room or how to preface their questions or how to use the Q&A database. And it's much easier for them if they were in a classroom to just raise their hand and say, hey, I don't understand, can you talk about that again? So I would say that this kind of style of learning is probably more geared to somebody who studies at home really well. On top of that, you're learning a subject that you're not familiar with. So not only do you need to be good at studying by yourself, you need to be comfortable studying difficult subjects you've never studied before by yourself. So if that's something that you're comfortable with and you don't think is a problem, I think that this style of learning is fine. But if you're someone who's a real hands-on learner, or you find yourself, speaking with and conversing with teachers for like a long time to get the understanding level that you need to move on, then I would probably encourage like a more standard boot camp where you're actually present in a classroom. Aside from that, though, I think that this is a good curriculum and teaches you a lot of really helpful things. I, again, would like to see a better emphasis on algorithms and data structures, and and maybe drop some of the lesser used stuff like jQuery and stuff like that. But aside from that, I did like a lot of the things they added, and I think that this is a good opportunity. If this is the kind of learning style that fits you, then that's great. As long as you think that this is going to work for you, then I would recommend it. So great. Again, though, remember, take all of my recommendations with a grain of salt, and form your own opinion after going through these materials yourself. So that's it. Yeah, let me know if there's any other curriculums you want me to review, and leave a comment and subscribe if you want to see more. So thanks.